Hello, welcome to a presentation called The Purple and Green, which is about ecofeminist theory and how it can be used to frame and understand women's place in the coming climate change scenarios. Now, before I start, I want to make some things clear. First of all, my approach to feminist theory is a transfeminist approach, so the so-called third wave of feminism. So when I talk about women, going forward, what I'm really talking about is feminized subjects. So people that face some of the possible discrimination that women face in our societies. And this may be even if they have not been assigned the female gender at birth. Next, I put a lot of resources and a lot of references in my presentation, but this is not because I want to give the impression that I am an authority on this subject. It's just because if you may disagree with things that I say, you can still have some useful resources and some texts that you can then read yourself if you're interested. And finally, this is an Italian word used in feminist circles. And so sbaglieranza means that what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do while thinking about these subjects is do a kind of huge change in our societies. And so, of course, we're going to make mistakes. It's going to be difficult. So sbaglieranza refers to this general sentiment that we are all working together, and the most important thing is that we're working together and not the errors that we might make. So to start, I talk about women's place in coming climate change scenarios. And what I mean by this, and what is largely talked about, is the gender-differentiated impacts of climate change. Here I'm citing from a United Nations report that gathers a lot of researches and a lot of literature on this topic. And what they find is that we have varied differentiated impacts of climate change where women face higher vulnerability to climate change effects. So, for example, there has been, and we predict, an increase in gender-based violence in places that are hit to climate change-related crises. Here, for example, I have a photo of a girl that leaves her parents' house due to a child marriage, and these types of child marriages have been increases in Bangladesh due to the impacts of climate change on communities. But also due to the fact that women usually gather natural resources such as water and firewood, and that these resources become more scarce and more difficult to obtain, women face difficulty in continuing their studies, and so they drop out of school, and largely they have less and less space in social interactions. Then, because climate change migrations usually and mostly involve men, women are left behind in their places of origin in more difficult situations with increased household workloads and a more insecure place in their society. Finally, there has been some concern about the fact that land property and land rights of women are usually not recognized because of lesser education and, in general, a lack of legal representation. And so this makes it more difficult to defend these land resources and to obtain aid when they're faced by some climate change-related crises. Now, I think we can see that these gender-differentiated impacts are mainly related to the Global South, but we must not forget that even in the Global North, this type of gender differentiation is present. Here, for example, I report the data of jobs lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic in Italy. I think we all know how the COVID-19 pandemic is related to climate change. And I think we also know, because it made many headlines, that most of the jobs lost due to the pandemic were women's jobs. And so this in Italy, but also in many other countries, widened the occupation gap between men and women. So even in a so-called developed country, we see this type of gender differentiation. And so looking at all of this information, we might think that women are somehow more inherently vulnerable to climate change impacts, but I don't think we should be thinking in this way. And here I take from a queer theorist and philosopher, very famous one, called Judith Butler. And they say that we shouldn't think of people as inherently vulnerable because this doesn't take into account a systemic level in which everyone is vulnerable in some way. In the sense that we all need some structures, some social structures, to make our lives possible. So to make a very crude example, many of us drive cars, but we do not know how to fix a car. And so our vulnerability to a problem with our car is not related to our inherent vulnerability as car owners, but to the fact that we can or cannot have access to a mechanic or to someone that can aid us when a problem with our car arises. And so the systemic level of this type of thinking is very, very important. And what do I mean by this? Well, to make an example, here in Turin, where I live, every year we have a marathon called Just the Woman I Am, which largely is about the need for an increased visibility of women's health problems and for the need of more research on these topics. I think we all know that this is not because women face worse health problems than men. Actually, it is statistically the opposite, usually. But because there has been a systematic lack of research of women's health issues, in particular on cancer in female bodies, but also because historically and epistemologically, there has been a bias that treats male bodies as the standard. And so pharmaceutical research, regulation, and commercialization is usually done with a male body in mind. And also we have societally stigma towards some female-specific health issues such as endometriosis. And so I wanted to take into account and to keep in mind this systemic level of what I'm talking about when I go from talking about the gender-differentiated impacts of climate change to the gender-differentiated causes of climate change. Now, what do I mean? Here, for example, we have some data regarding the distribution of CO2 emissions in the global population. And this is a very, very skewed distribution because 10%, the top 10% of emitters, contribute as much as the other 90% in regards to CO2 emissions. But because this is largely related to income, we see that women make up less than 30% of this top 10% of the world's population. On the other hand, there has also been some research about the fact that in general, the consumption patterns of men have a higher CO2 footprint than those of women. And so I'm not saying, of course, that single men are more culpable of climate change than single women, but generally speaking, and again at this systemic level, we see a male bias also in what is causing climate change in this aspect of CO2 emissions. And so finally we come to what ecofeminism is. So ecofeminism is a way to explain why we see this male bias in ecological terms. So why do men, generally speaking again, have more agency in causing climate change, but are at the same time more shielded from its effect? The ecofeminist answer to this question is that the place and the exploitation of women and nature has much in common. And so it is no wonder then when our exploitation of non-human bodies and non-human entities comes to the level that it is today, leading to the current climate crisis, women are also more vulnerable because this is coherent with a systemic value structure. This type of structure is a value hierarchy in which men and male bodies are more important than women's and non-human bodies. And so there's a direct parallel between these two types of discriminations. And this is actually the same ideology, and it is patriarchy. And so, on a more positive sense, the struggle for women's liberation is not only affecting gender discrimination, but it is in some way deconstructing a value structure that also causes the ecological crisis that we are seeing today. Now, I think you can see that this type of thinking is very much based in ideas and values, but I think it has some very practical implications. To talk about these practical implications, I need to introduce another field of study, which is political ecology. Now, it is somewhat difficult to give a concise definition of what political ecology is, but I would say that it is the study of the ecological crisis not as a technical problem, the way that, for example, scientists and engineers look at it, so which technologies we use, the effect that this has on the environment, how much CO2 we pour into the atmosphere, and so on. So a look at the ecological crisis not through a technological lens, but through a societal lens. And so which socially dysfunctional dynamic has caused the current climate crisis? Political ecology studies our relation to non-human entities, what is usually called nature in our societies, and how we value nature, how we relate to it, but also the way in which we exploit non-human entities and how we organize this exploitation, which largely has to do with the economy. And so I want to set up a parallel between political ecology and ecofeminism to show how they can both be used to understand our current state of things. Now, to start, let's start with the political ecology side by analyzing this paper, which is very famous and very controversial, I would say, which was published in 1997. In this paper, Costanza and other researchers tried to give a monetary value in terms of dollars to all the ecosystem services, so the natural resources and the services that are used by humans, provided by the world's ecosystems in a year. And in this study, they came to the conclusion that the value, if we were to value it in dollars, of all these services is much greater than what is produced by humans on an annual level. But we know that we use these services, of course, and actually we use them to the point of nowadays putting them in crisis. And I've represented this state of things through the Rockstrom planetary boundaries, which represent how much we are overshooting the so-called carrying capacity of our planet. So there are all of these ecosystem services that we use, and yet we do not give value to them. And we have this current crisis and their exploitation. And the political ecology view of this is that this is no contradiction. And it is, in fact, because we do not give them explicit economical value, we do not give an economical value to ecosystem services, that we can exploit them in the way we are now. And of course, there are a lot of theories on how and why we currently do not give any value to these ecosystem services. But the main point is this, that in order to exploit all of this value, all of this, let's call it labor, provided by Earth's ecosystem, we need to not give them an explicit value. It is a function that is needed for their current exploitation. I think you may see where this parallel is going, but there's another type of work, this time done by humans, which is largely unpaid and not given explicit values in our economy. And this is, of course, care work, so tending for the elderly, cooking, cleaning, and raising children. And this type of labor, especially the unpaid part of this type of care work, is done by women, as we can see here in this figure. And also, if this type of care work, unpaid care work, were to be given an explicit value in our economies, this would make up a large portion of all the labor done yearly. And I think you can understand why I made this parallel. So, in the ecofeminist view, as we have said, women and nature, so to speak, but non-human entities have the same place in the value hierarchy of our society. So patriarchy gives them the same place largely. And we can see here that also in economic terms, in very practical terms, we have the same thing. So women and ecosystems, so non-human entities, produce a large amount of value which is not given an explicit evaluation in our economies and is therefore needed and exploited by our current system. So what do I mean by this parallel and by this ecofeminist frame? Do we need to just give an explicit value to these types of labor or value in our economies? I'm not so sure, and actually I would say no. We have seen some attempts to set up markets or to include both women and non-human entities in our economies, and I would say that they have shown clear problems. On the ecosystem side, we have seen that emission trading schemes, so market solutions to climate change to limit CO2 emissions, have largely failed. And also, the markets that have been set up for ecosystem services, so markets where explicitly the services provided by ecosystems are given value and this value is exchanged, have shown problems in regard to possible negative outcomes for poor communities. And largely, they have shown that some actors, mainly big corporations, have far more power than small communities. And more in general, the effectiveness of these types of market solutions in defending ecosystem services and maintaining them is highly questionable. On the other hand, we have also seen an inclusion of women in the workforce, but this hasn't led to a more equitable distribution of care work in our societies, both paid and unpaid. So in dual income households where there's a man and a woman, we still see that the woman has to do both the paid labor and when she comes home, the unpaid labor. And this has also been called a double shift for women. So their hours of labor have increased significantly, and more importantly, they have increased more than men's work hours. And so what I mean is that we need a type of system change, which is largely what I've talked about with ecofeminism. We need to subvert the value hierarchy, which makes possible the exploitation of both women's and non-human entities' work and value. And this type of system change, it is certainly a societal value change, but as I have shown, is also a very practical change. If we were to give agency and value to both women's and non-human entities' lives, we would need to change dramatically how our current societies and economies work. And of course, this is a very tall order, it is very difficult. And here I cite from a geography professor at the Sorbonne University called Rachele Borghi. And she says that, of course, we feel a sense of vertigo when we think about changing the current world system, because, of course, we do not know if we will ever see a better world, if we will ever live in a even marginally better world. And so it is very difficult to think about this type of change, but we need to take this responsibility. We need to see and understand why this change is needed, and we need to try and experiment ways to be part of this change, to stop being oppressors and start being allies. And I hope that I have shown you how we can understand why this type of change is needed, but also some ways in which this may happen,